All right, let's get started. Welcome to Leadership Cafe, first one in 2017. We're going to talk about the best leadership book you've probably never read. But out of morbid curiosity, how many of you, if any of you, have read Reframing Organizations by Bolman and Deal? Anybody?
I bought it. Does that count?
You bought it. You own it. It is on your shelf. That's at least 50% of the battle right there, right? I actually have a dedicated space on my desk for books that I own and have not yet read and intend to read, as opposed to several of the books on my shelves that I own and probably don't have such good intentions to read. This is Reframing Organizations. This is one edition old. A new edition comes out every 5 years, and so the last one was in 2013, was the 5th edition. I'm assuming they will come out with a 6th edition in 2018 because it's a very successful book. You can see by its size why a lot of people have not read this book. Okay, it's I think almost 450 content pages, and then there are several pages of bibliography and appendixes and all kinds of things in this. This is an organizational behavior textbook, meaning they use it in classes at the master's level, at the doctorate level, and in some bachelor level business courses as kind of the beginning point, and for some the ending point on how to lead an organization. And the interesting thing about this book is that it is not there is only one way to do it. What they do is they go through most of the literature out there and they extract best practices and teach people how to think about leadership and organizations and team leadership from a variety of perspectives. And so that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to skip through this book. Hopefully by the end, you will either think, I really don't need to read that because I captured enough of it, or you are so curious about what the rest of it is that you run out and buy it. I'm a huge fan of this book. I would give it to everybody that I know in a leadership position, except I would be very, very broke if I did that. So anyway, you can get an older edition on Amazon for just a few bucks. The current edition is always 50 or 60 or whatever it is, but go one edition older like I have, and it's really not that expensive, and it is a really good resource. So we're going to go through that today. Again, if you have been to a leadership cafe before, you're familiar with this slide. I'm always encouraging you to think critically. There is nothing in what I'm about to tell you that is infallible. There is very little in here that I'm going to say that I couldn't argue the other side if properly motivated. And so the point of us here is to talk about leadership in a way that we can say, does that really work? Does that really mean what you think it means? Does that apply to my situation? And not everything that we're going to talk about today will apply to each of your contexts. But the point of gathering like this, and especially around tables, is to ask critical questions, to think about not just the material being presented, but how it applies to your context, and then hopefully to build your own capacity, to take something home with you today that will make you a better leader or help you think better, whatever the case is. Speaking of thinking, can anybody tell me what this is? Okay, we got a race car. It's actually called the Mazda Speed. And this is one of the images that you get if you Google future cars. Okay, so answer for me, is this a car or a motorcycle? You're like, yes it is.
It's an autocycle.
It's an autocycle. Now people are just making up words. Okay? Is that what it's called, an autocycle?
Polaris has one. They had it on the newsletter.
That's actually what motivated me to put this slide in there. There were people driving around it's the Spider, right? That's what it's called? And the news guy who was going for a test drive in this got in and said, I don't even know what this thing is, but let's take it out on the road. And that actually motivated me to put, that was too easy though, because you see those everywhere. I've never actually seen one of these with my own eyes. But I think it's a fascinating way to talk about mental models. Now, if you see this picture and you immediately think, okay, it's a race car. Now, what helped you determine that it's a race car?
just the design, it looks very good with aerodynamics and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it looks fast, right? So you're assuming that it can really move. It's got a little fin at the back. It's got a number at the back, right? So these are telltale signs of a race car, especially in this day and age. It's got sponsorship stuff all over the place. You know it's made by Mazda. What makes you think that it's not a typical car? What gave you pause?
3 wheel.
Right, 3 wheels. Now, when you think of car, what do you think of? If I just say the word car, what do you think of?
4 doors, 4 wheels.
4 doors, 4 wheels.
Does it have 4 wheels? It's 2 wheels.
It's got 3 wheels. Well, I guess this might be 2 wheels in the back. So, okay.
Modified.
Okay, yeah. So the placement of 4 wheels, okay? So in some ways, this conflicts with your mental model of what a car is, okay? A mental model is a way that we instinctively organize information, okay? So when we come up against an image or a question or something, we immediately and unconsciously run it through a filter of, does this line up in this category or in this category? You know, when I first saw this, I was like, is that a car or a motorcycle? And immediately I thought, okay, it doesn't have 2 wheels, it has more than 2 wheels, so maybe not a motorcycle. I didn't notice that there were 2 wheels in the back. Thank you for that, Lee. So I thought 3 wheels, and this must be not quite a car, because a car has 4 wheels. In that blink, right, that I'm processing all of that information, I am running it through my mental model of what this is, just to answer this question, what is this thing? Okay? And we do this all day long in a variety of situations. If you ever played sports, you have a particular understanding for how that sport works to such a degree that you see basketball players in particular display a specific kind of what they call court sense, which is when a guy gets a ball, he knows where pretty much everybody else is going to be, and it enables him to pass quicker. You see certain football quarterbacks, they just know when they pull away from the snap and they have the ball, they know I can throw here, I can't throw here. If you watch the Cowboy-Packer game, you saw this go terribly wrong for Dak Prescott because he threw it right to a Green Bay Packer. And the reason was, when he pulled away, he thought there will not be a Green Bay Packer there. The Green Bay Packer thought, I know exactly where he's going with the ball, and it looked like they were playing catch in the backyard. Okay, so sorry if that's rubbing salt in any Cowboy fans' wounds today, but this is kind of how we organize information, and we do this all the time. So what the authors of this book did was they said, okay, there is a way that leaders conceptualize leadership. They bring their own kind of mental models to their context of leadership, and it enables people to make judgments quicker. It also gets people into trouble occasionally. And so the authors of this book talk about how there is a point when people who are normally smart people, they do something dumb, right? And you read it in the newspapers and you're like, what? Why would they ever do something like that? And maybe it was in the throes of a moment they made a bad decision, or maybe it was that they took a bunch of information and ran it through the wrong frame or the wrong mental model or saw it through the wrong lens and drew an incorrect conclusion about this. So what these authors did was they said, okay, maybe one frame, one way of looking at organizational leadership isn't the way we should go. When it comes to framing, here's a really good quote, and this kind of goes to the existence of mental models. It says, the world simply can't be made sense of, facts can't be organized unless you have a mental model to begin with. That theory doesn't have to be the right one because you can alter it along the way as information comes in, but you can't begin to learn without some concept that gives you an expectation or a hypothesis. The car motorcycle example is like this. I know basically what a car is and what a motorcycle is. And so when I see the picture of a 3-wheel car or a weird-looking motorcycle, it's okay that I don't have to completely understand what a car is and what a motorcycle is. I have a starting point, right? And I can build or change or alter from that starting point. But where we begin to process information is a real determinant on where we end up with that information. Does that make sense? So if you wander the bookstores and you look for leadership books, in fact, just yesterday, I got a text from my pastor who is not here, and he'll live with me telling this story. But he texted me and he said, "Hey, what's one of the best leadership books you've ever read?" And I texted him back. I said, "You're messing with me, right? Like, since you're not coming to Leadership Cafe tomorrow, and that's the actual subject, you're just messing with me." And he had a good laugh, and he's like, "No, I'm actually in Barnes & Noble, and I'm looking at these shelves, and I'm wondering if you could help me pick these out." And so I said, "Okay, fine, I'll let that go this one time, Pastor." So if you wander Barnes & Noble and you look at leadership books, you'll see books like this. You'll see The Last Link, which is very much about data and very much about analytics and how to connect data and analytics to decision making. It's a very different kind of leadership book than The Speed of Trust, which is a Covey book written about relationships primarily and how to build trust in those relationships, which is very different than this next book, Secrets to Winning at Office Politics. And I love subtitles that are much, much longer than the original title. How to Achieve Your Goals and Increase Your Influence at Work. Okay? Now, just tell me your reaction to that book. How to Win at Office Politics. What is that book going to help you do? Yeah, it's about tactics, about being political. And when we sit, now leave all the presidential jokes aside, I know it's inauguration week, but when you think of politics, what do you immediately think of? It's negative. Winning, or it's negative. And we got two mental models at work right there. Okay? Manipulation.
One side or the other.
Okay, yeah, definitely one side or the other, winners, losers. So you see different mental models of just what is behind politics come to work there when we say, okay, how do we make sense of that book title? And then that book title is different than the Starbucks Experience, and the subtitle, 5 Principles for Turning Ordinary into Extraordinary. Now, do you get the same feeling about this book title as you do from the others? The Starbucks Experience. What do you think that book is about?
Culture.
Do what?
Culture.
Yeah, creating culture. So each of these books, you might see these on the shelves at Barnes & Noble, and each of these gives you a very distinct slant on leadership, right? So if you read one of those books, you'll get pretty good in-depth knowledge, but only one perspective. You would have to read all of those books in order to get kind of a rounded out perspective. And that is the impetus behind this book, Reframing Organizations. So what they did was they said, all right, present in those books, and actually I grabbed these from the example that they list, you have a data and analytics driven thing, you have a relationship driven thing, you have politics, and then you have kind of culture symbolism. What if we wrote a book and taught people how to think about leadership in and through each of those frames, but also encouraged leaders to say, hey, if one frame immediately presents itself, that may not necessarily be the best frame to operate from. And so that is the onus of this book. And they said, really, frame breaking is a necessity. Now, these are the 4 frames that they talk about. They talk about structural, human resource, political, and symbolic. And in this book, not only do they walk you through each of these frames, but they also kind of walk you through the how and the diagnostics behind, okay, how do we know that one frame isn't necessarily giving us the full picture? And how do we understand when somebody comes to us with a problem or an issue within our team or within our organization based out of one frame, that a response may not necessarily be in that same frame? And so we're going to walk through that a little bit today. Now, I'm not going to again, there's 450 content pages in here, so I'm not going to walk you exhaustively through. They spend 3 chapters on each of these frames. In fact, I'm going to mostly skip structural and human resource and spend time on political and symbolic, because I think most leaders, when they come to a leadership task, they are thinking structurally. When people bring them a problem or an issue, they're thinking human resource. They're thinking about human relationships. I think an understanding of politics, and not necessarily in a negative, manipulative way there, and an understanding of symbolism within leadership really helps to round out leaders. It's why that, especially, my job is to work with pastors and ministry leaders, and I beg pastors to read this book. Because I can't tell you how many pastors I've met, especially when they're really, really young, saying, well, when I get to be a pastor, I'm not going to mess with politics. Okay, I'm not going to get dragged into that. Okay, that's fine. Really read this book, please. Really. Or you'll just be in my office in a few years. But that's fine too. That's okay. And so we're going to spend time going through these 4 frames. But underneath these 4 frames, you have kind of a central concept. Okay, the structural frame looks at things by roles, goals, and policies. Okay. The human resource frame looks at things from a needs perspective and a relationship perspective. The political frame looks at power, and again, not necessarily negative, and conflict, again, not necessarily negative. And the symbolic frame looks at things in terms of culture and meaning. So, real quickly, let's go through the structural approach or the structural frame. This is the oldest leadership approach after follow me, okay? So once leadership really started to be studied, and this happened in large part around the time of the Industrial Revolution, you have the early 1900s, everybody's trying to figure out how to squeeze the most productivity that they can out of either a machine or a system of machines, a factory, an organization, whatever it is. How do we get to be uber productive? And in those early days, people were seen as a means to an end, right? People were just cogs in the structure. And so how do we work it to where we get the most bang for our buck? And so you see on this that structure was built around transforming the raw materials, whatever raw materials you're working with, into the finished product. And in these days, especially in the early 1900s, this was all about, okay, how do we turn steel into railroads? How do we build this into this? How do we turn wood into houses? Whatever it is, how do we get those finished products? Now, and again, the structural frame's not bad, okay? This is the frame that I tend to default to. I like systems. I like organizing things. I like boxes and arrows that we've made jokes about in previous leadership cafes. And so without structure, organizations can really be misdirecting their energy and their resources. So structure is not bad. There is no one best way to organize. And this flies in the face of the early scholars that were looking at structure and productivity. Frederick Taylor wrote in the early 1900s, he's rolling over in his grave right now with me saying there's no one best way to organize. But especially as we have developed as a society, as our organizations and teams have taken on new looks and new tasks, as we have dealt with globalization and technology, all of a sudden people are starting to feel the freedom to organize structurally however best meets their need. Okay? And that really took off in the 80s and has only multiplied since then with the development of internet and virtual technologies and all of that. But the bottom line for the structural frame is you organize people around the processes needed to achieve the goal, as opposed to saying, okay, I've got a bunch of people here, how do I organize them, and then we'll figure out what to do, or around achieving the goal without the idea of processes in mind, right? If you approach your organization with a blank slate and say, okay, here are our goals, now let's build our team to go get those goals. Actually, the middle step there, the processes that you need to achieve those goals, is what is the best determinant for your organization. Okay? How do you hire? How do you fire? How do you reorganize? All of those things are determined by the processes to achieve the goal, not necessarily the goal themselves. Are you with me so far? All right. So let's look at one more thing, and this is about high quality teams. And again, the authors go really in depth on this. I just think these are some good principles for leading teams. And these are either volunteer teams or paid teams. So just some very basic characteristics. First off, they shape purpose in response to a demand or an opportunity placed in their path, usually by higher management. What that basically says is high quality teams don't just sit around having coffee one day and go, you know what, we should do something. right? There's always a goal or a process. There's a demand put in front of them. They translate common practices into SMART goals. Who knows what SMART stands for there?
Specific, measurable, attainable, or I can remember that too.
Yeah, and R&T, yeah, yeah. Realistic and timely, yeah. And that's usually where people fall apart. We've got the specific, we've got the measurable, but you don't set a timetable on it. It's just that ongoing goal, right? We've all sat in meetings where we have an agenda item that gets carried from month to month, and then pretty soon it just becomes part of the agenda, right? You're just like, hey, have we done that? No. Okay, next, and then we move on. So that's an indication, not a SMART goal. Measurable size, okay? So the team itself has to be a manageable size. They develop the right mix of expertise. This typically happens, this goes wrong a lot of times in software companies, where you have a bunch of engineers doing engineer stuff, and then engineers don't know how to get along with each other well enough, and they're like, who around here has a real passion for human relations? And they're like, I don't know, we're all engineers. We're all software people, so figure it out, right? Not probably the best human relations response, and I didn't make up that example. Let's just say I'm speaking for a friend. So, good high-quality teams have a good mix of expertise. They develop a common commitment to working relationships. That means teams support one another, build into one another, and they hold themselves collectively accountable. That's all I'm going to do on structure, okay? There's a ton in there on structure, on how to best organize as far as where the moving parts tend to be, what the moving parts tend to be, how models have changed over the years, what is a centralized organization scheme versus a decentralized organization scheme. All of that is really good. If you've never read Starfish and the Spider, you should read it. It's really good, talking about the ways that organizations have changed from centralized top-down to decentralized. Things are doing their own, teams are doing their own thing. How do we still maintain some sense of order and direction in a model like that? And so I would highly recommend it to you. The human resource frame. Again, there are a ton of leadership books on the human resource frame, but the bottom line for this is successful organizations invest in people. And again, this is a relatively new concept, especially in leadership literature, but also in business literature. There was a time when people would employ other people thinking, I want to get the most out of them as if they were an orange. I want to squeeze them and get everything that they have and then toss them aside and find a new orange. Somewhere along the line, the thinking shifted and said, you know what, if we developed this particular orange, it would continue to produce juice and we don't have to just squeeze it and toss it. And so how do we invest in people? Now, whenever somebody, like me stands up and says, invest in your employees, invest in your teammates, invest in your workers, there is somebody else from the other side of that perspective thinking what? Do what? Yeah, what's it going to cost? For sure. Yeah, there's definitely a bottom line implication of this. Somebody else is going to have a problem with it too. What's the counter argument to investing in people? Go ahead. Right, yeah. You're doing a really good development program for somebody else's future employee. Yeah. So how do we respond to that? Because that's a legitimate beef. What if they leave? Right? What if I pour all this energy into them and develop them and teach them new skills and they take those new skills and they go get a new job? Right? What's the counter argument to that?
I think in the church context, for me, it's very easy. That's called discipleship.
Okay.
You should suck it up, and if God calls him out, then he calls him out.
I like that. That'll be a former HR policy right there. Suck it up. Okay? This is the way we roll. Okay? All right. I'm good with that. I'm good with that. What else is the other approach? Let's say you're not in a ministry context where the argument's much easier. What if you're in a I don't know, pick any industry other than ministry. What's the argument to somebody saying, it costs too much money, they're just going to leave anyway?
Return.
Spell that out for me. Right. Well, yeah. No, I mean, I know the ROI, but how do you justify the ROI if you are indeed training other people's future employees.
Well, if you compensate people well enough, and that's what motivates them.
Oh, then that helps you keep them.
Right.
Okay, there's definitely a retention part of that, sure. Not just the kind of hard, tactile cash ROI, but there's an emotional ROI, right? People like to work in places that care about them. That wasn't always, I think that's always been a generally accepted practice. It wasn't always folded into policy, though. There were a lot of organizations like, hey, it's gravy if people like working here. But as long as they come, punch their ticket, do their job, then we will get what we need to out of them, right? There are still companies that run this way. And then there are other companies that go above and beyond to invest in their employees, not only to keep them and retain them, but also to make their company better. Because what they've learned, and we talked about this in previous cafes, especially in transformational leadership, when employees feel that they are invested in, when employees feel like they have a voice, they tend to contribute more than just the 9 to 5. They tend to take some ownership. In fact, in certain circumstances, they start to equate their self-identity with the identity of the organization. And coming back to ministry circles, as a pastor and a ministry leader, that's what you want, right? You want people saying, I'm not just coming to church to work. I want people coming out of their passion. I want that passion to be transmitted. I want people to follow that passion and to extend it. And so if we're doing this year, now we're going to do that next year. You get that by investing in people. And so they talk about it a little bit in hiring the right people, in not just investing in employees, but empowering them. And one of these little facets here is called redesign of work. There is a well-documented decrease in productivity when somebody does the same thing over and over and over again the same way, right? Now, in an industrial or a mechanical environment, you might say you can only get cars a certain way, right? We got to produce cars, whatever. But by moving employees around and teaching them new skills, you aren't changing anything about the process, you aren't changing anything about the end result, but the employee gets kind of a new shot, a new, a reinvigorated opportunity to come to work and go, okay, well, yeah, we're still producing widgets, but now I have a different role in producing that widget, and all of a sudden, work is okay again, right? Now, that alone doesn't get you over the finish line, but that helps. There's also a rule in here when it talks about hiring that you put your best people in charge of your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. Now again, I can argue both sides of this, but what do you think about that? You put your best people in charge of your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. Your
biggest problems are your biggest opportunities.
Yeah, sometimes two birds with one stone, that's true, yeah. Do you agree with that statement? Disagree with that statement?
It's not true all the time.
When would it not be true?
When the problem is caused by internal.
Oh, okay. When the problem's internal? Okay.
Or when the threat or problem is so large that it could take the organization out.
Right.
That's when you want to put your best people on that. Okay?
I think forward motion is what's going to always kind of be the great equalizer. I mean, it's cheaper to get new clients than to keep an old client. And I think if you put your best person on opportunities, there's always that forward momentum and that growth.
Interesting.
But sometimes the problem with your bread and butter, and what's keeping the lights on,
Yeah.
is if you don't fix that, everyone, there's not going to be any future opportunities.
Right, yeah.
I'd say if you've identified what these people are best at, then you put the more risk-averse problem solvers, engineer types, to solve problems, and the risk-embracing, sales-driven people to do your opportunities. Opportunities in a company usually is more about sales and revenues, and problems happen, or we solve problems to cut costs.
Sure.
So operations versus sales.
Sure. Yeah, and in going along with that line, unless your biggest problem is a team that's dysfunctioning, and then the engineer types are going to have to be in an environment where it's all relational. And so that can also muddy the waters as far as what you get out of that too. This is one of these statements, put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems, that I tend to agree with, but I can definitely see the other side of things. And I think one of the points in the book that they would say is you don't, if one of your biggest problems is kind of an internal squabble, you don't waste your best people on something that would keep them constrained. Does that make sense? And so they're thinking in a bunch of different ways, but I thought I would toss that out because it's an interesting dilemma. It's one of those things that, especially if I as a manager, and I'm like, man, I got this problem over here, and it's not my sweet spot at all. Like this just isn't, but I know a guy or a woman who would be fantastic at this, and it'd be huge for the organization. They're a high capacity person. I really want to put them over here. In one sense, I'm hiring them to kind of constrain that problem, right? Because it's not in my wheelhouse. And in another sense, I'm saying I would probably mess that up. But if I'm hiring this person who's high capacity and well suited for that, then it makes a lot of sense. So I think there's an argument in both ways. But those are the kind of arguments that pop up in the human resource frame. So let's mess with politics. Now, the pictures behind these words are not an accident. And so there's a factory behind the word structure. There's the indication of a relationship behind the human resource. Politics, the metaphor for politics in the book is called the jungle. Okay, now, there are a lot of ways to conceptualize politics and to talk about it. And so for the sake of today, I'm going to ask you to leave Washington out of it. Okay? Let's stay more in the theory for a second. We'll see how long that lasts, but let's try it. And so in 1985, a guy named John Cotter, who has written a bunch of stuff on leadership, wrote Leading Change, if you've ever read that. He said that he believed too many managers are either naive or cynical about organizational politics. And I would add to that, you will either live by them or die by them, but those are your only two choices. Okay? You can ignore politics, and you will get killed by them. Okay? Now, to be savvy, to be politically savvy, on a scale of, well, does that sound more negative or more positive? If I said that person's politically savvy, how does that hit you?
I think it's positive because they know how to deal with differing viewpoints and how to meet people where they are.
Okay.
So I think if they have that skill, I think that's a really positive skill.
Okay.
In my case, I would see it positive, but I see how now it can be seen as a negative thing.
Okay. Okay. How many of
The inference is manipulative. Yeah, being
Sure.
manipulative.
Yeah, because there's a very fine line, right, between what Peter said and manipulative, right? You can understand people, and you can understand how to work people, right? You can understand people and see their perspective and use that perspective to get something, right? So there's a very fine line in all of this. So let's jump down in here. They define politics, okay, and specifically the political frame, as the realistic process of making decisions and allocating resources in a context of scarcity among coalitions of people grouped by enduring divergent interests. Okay? Let that settle in for a second. The realistic process of making decisions and allocating resources in a context of scarcity among coalitions of people grouped by enduring divergent interests. Now, what does that say to you? What is politics? A lot of words.
Making the most of what you have.
Okay, making the most of what you have. Sure.
It's necessary.
It's necessary. Keeping different people happy. Yeah. To me, one of the things that pops out here is the enduring divergent interests. In other words, politics is not getting people to come in from their positions or change their minds necessarily. It can be, but a lot of times it is working with people who are entrenched in a particular thought or belief and still making it work. Does that make sense? The other thing is, and some people, this is a real sticking point, this the context of scarcity. I get a lot of pushback on this concept, especially in ministry circles, right? Well, we don't work for a God who has a scarcity economy. There's an abundance mentality there, and I'm good with that. I believe that. So where does the context of scarcity come in? Like, why am I okay putting it on the slide here?
Time is a big part of ministry. Decisions need to be made. You can't choose all options. You have to choose one option. It has to work within a time frame.
Yeah, and I think time being finite and concrete speaks to a lot of this. I don't think that it is wandering off theologically, for me personally, to say that we operate a lot of times in contexts that are scarcity while working for a God who believes and practices abundance. Does that make sense?
Say it again.
I don't believe that it is wandering off theologically to say that we operate in environments that have scarce resources while at the same time believing that our God is a God of abundance. And time has a lot to do with that. Now, because this is their operating definition of what politics is, that necessitates that conflict is natural and inevitable, right? People are always, if there's a scarcity of resources or a scarcity of time or something that two divergent interests both want, conflict is inevitable. And so what these authors do, and what I think they do very, very well, is they approach conflict as being natural and appropriate. Now, some people just hear the word conflict and they think it may be natural, but it's never appropriate, right? These are conflict-averse people. Now, some people like conflict, and they're like, sure, conflict is natural, and I happen to be good at it. That's a whole different thing. That's a whole different leadership cafe. But what they say is, in an organizational environment, there's a balance to be maintained when it comes to conflict. Having too little conflict gets you over to this dark place. Having too much conflict gets you over to that dark place. And so somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot. And the political frame focuses on strategy for tactics dealing with conflict. And so if conflict is kind of that key dynamic within the political frame, then power is the most important asset. And we talked about power last time and how power comes in all shapes and sizes, and some are legitimate sources of power, some are positional sources of power, some are personal. We talked about legitimate power, using the president, saying the buck stops there. We have ensconced laws and constitutions to say that's where the buck stops, that's where the buck stops. So that is a legitimate source of power. There is a reward power, and I use the owner of the Texans here to say he has the ability and the capacity to hand out bonuses or to withhold bonuses and or contracts. And so even though the players play for the coach, right, and they play for the coordinators, the coach isn't the one writing their contract. The coach isn't the one saying, well, you did really good, we'll give you that bonus. That's the owner. And so a reward power is different than legitimate power. There's coercive power, right? Tyrannical power. That is, I have the means to make things happen with or without your agreement or acceptance. So that's coercive power. Informational power has really come to the forefront in the last 10 years or so, and this is the people who know stuff have the ability to shape decisions, right? By either telling you something or by not telling you something. And people who hold informational power may not even be the ones, and probably aren't the ones, who are making actual decisions. What they're doing is controlling how decisions get made and the outcome of those decisions by the information that they possess. Now, Those are all positional. There's also personal sources of power. Expert is someone who, and I put Rick Warren up here because the man goes on CNN and is asked the question, what do Christians think about fill in the blank, right? Well, Rick Warren has been recognized to such a level of expertise that he is trusted to speak on behalf of, or at least trusted to be sought out on behalf of, millions and millions of people they call Rick, right? Expert power is confined to a domain for the most part. When expertise is no longer confined to a domain, you have referent power. And I have Warren Buffett up here because people will make decisions on what kind of soft drink to drink based on what he drinks. He's a big fan of Coke, by the way. He's held Coke stock for years. In fact, he claims he drinks 5 Cokes a day. How the man's still alive if he does that, I'm not sure, but he clearly is. And so, when his company buys other companies, people say, I'm going to own that product, right? I want to go buy my house from that person or my carpet from that person. The shareholders meeting for Berkshire Hathaway in Omaha, Nebraska every year is almost a carnival. It's a vendor show, but it is a huge thing. You have to buy tickets a long time in advance. It's this huge thing. You're like, this is a shareholders meeting? But it is, And his expert power has risen and transcended domains to such a degree that people just refer to Warren Buffett. Does that make sense? All of those are sources of power. Now, the other thing that the authors point out in this book is there is a framing power. And we'll get to this a little bit when we get to symbols, but there is a power in someone who tells you what this symbol means or what this symbol means or that this has meaning and this doesn't have meaning. That's called framing power, and we're going to get to that later. But all of these sources of power come really into play in the political frame, right? Because when you have issues that require the easing of conflict or the negotiating of conflict, you're going to resort to one of these kinds of power to get that resolution that you need. And sometimes it's very legitimate. Sometimes you just say, I'm the boss and I understand there's a conflict there, but this is what we're doing. Other people, tyrants will say, well, I'm not the boss, but hey, here's a coup. Now I am the boss and now we're doing this, okay? We have resolved our conflict by me having more tanks than you. So, all of these sources of power come into play. And John Cotter, again, says, okay, all of that is true within the political frame, but what we need is what he calls benevolent politicians. Okay? So here's your second really long quote of the day. Beyond the yellow brick road of naivete and the mugger's lane of cynicism, there is a narrow path, poorly lighted, hard to find, and even harder to stay on once found. People who have the skill and perseverance to take that path serve us in countless ways. We need more of these people, many more. And he's talking about this idea of people who use this political skill, right, this political savvy for the good of other people, right? I'm not just doing it to work people or work a situation for my own personal gain. I'm actually doing it for the betterment of people. And so whether that is an organization or a country or team or whatever, there are certain political skills that politically savvy people have and that people who want to be politically savvy develop. The first one of those is called agenda setting. This is the reason that the first 100 days of an administration is so important, okay? And this isn't a recent phenomenon, but presidents who take the White House spend a lot of time focusing on what are we going to do in our first 100 days. Why do they do that?
It sets the agenda for the rest of the term.
Yeah, it not only sets the agenda, which is where are we going and how are we going to get there, right? That's the agenda. But what else does it do in addition to telling people this is important, this isn't important? What else does it do?
Culture, expectations?
Yeah, right? It sets a tone, right? If we're going to take this on in the first 100 days, and assuming that we have put some thought into how we are prioritizing these things, the higher priority things mean we're going to be dealing with this over a longer period of time, right? These are the hot button issues. These are the big rocks. Use whatever metaphor you want to. But if it's going into that first 100 days of the agenda, this is going to be really important.
And they typically have the most political capital at that point because they're still in a honeymoon period.
Sure.
If something is not going to be popular, at least they get it through and deal with it.
And you see this in the corporate world all the time too, right? A new CEO is hired. The new CEO is hired on a mandate to do something, and because this person hasn't spent any of that capital yet, they're like, well, you brought me in to reorganize, I just laid off that entire division, or I just combined these two things, or now we're going to open up 2 more factories in these places because this is what you hired me to do. So the honeymoon phase is really accurate there.
It's really true in a church.
It's
It's exceptionally true in a church.
how so?
Well, usually your search committee goes out and finds the kind of pastor your church needs, and so that pastor is brought in with a mandate, usually from that search committee.
Sure.
And because nobody has anything against him yet, he can get some things done.
Right. He also has not spent any of that capital. True. Yeah, true. And you see this a lot of times in searches that come right after or during conflict, right? Or, the numbers aren't, attendance isn't what it once was, or, we're not reaching our neighborhood. We're bringing in this person to help lead that initiative, so go lead, right? And in that, I'm giving you permission and I'm giving you, credits to spend and saying, okay, let's see what you do with them. So they come charging out of the gate. Now, leaders who don't come charging out of the gate, what is the tone that they're setting? Could be setting.
Some come in and say, I don't want to make any changes, I want to learn, I want to use my ears versus my one mouth to figure out what's going on here before I make any changes. It all depends on the situation, that organization, company, whatever.
Yeah, it depends on the organization and to some degree the personality of the person coming in.
Perceived as negligence or humility.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But the building's on fire. Shouldn't we put that out? No. Let's assess the situation. Do we really want to put that fire out? How are we feeling about that? Yeah. So we're into negligence there. Sure. Now, some leaders come in and they start the fire, at which point you're like, now we're in negligence, but in a totally different way, right? So yeah, it depends on the organization to some degrees, and it depends on the leader's personality. And there are definitely some that come in and say, things are moving relatively well. There's probably room for improvement, but before I go kicking in doors, I don't need to necessarily upset the apple cart right away. Let's get a lay of the land here. So the first political skill really is agenda setting and knowing the fervency with which to set that agenda. And I see a lot of first-time pastors that have a real good sense of agenda setting. They have no sense whatsoever for how forcefully to set that agenda, right? They are coming in going, okay, I have just been brought in as the leader. I had a 90% vote, right? So everybody loves me. That's a key miscommunication right there. But anyway, right? So I'm going to kick in the door with my agenda and I'm off to the races. Sometimes people don't have a problem with the agenda. They have a problem with how the agenda is presented. And most of that is due to the incoming leader not knowing the political terrain, which is this next skill, political skill. It's called mapping the political terrain. And this is huge. So when looking at, and this can be done at the team level or the organization level or the industry, right? Politicians are doing this for the entire country. But whatever the domain is and whatever the context is, here are 4 things about political mapping, and then I'll show you how it works on the next slide. Understanding the intersection of players in terms of their interests and their power. So 1, determine channels of informal communication, right? This is something that all leaders should know is happening. There's always talk, right? Whether you hear it or not doesn't matter. There is always talk. So where are the channels of informal communication? Where are the hallways that people stop in to chat? Where are the proverbial water coolers, right? Where are the Facebook pages or the Facebook users, whatever? Where is that informal communication happening? Who are the principal agents of political influence? Meaning, who helps shape what other people think? And not everybody has the same capacity for influence. And that's not a bad thing. That's just reality. Analyze possibilities for mobilizing players, meaning who is wanting to be used, to be led, to be sent. You know, who's ready to, you know, proverbially get in the game, and who just wants to sit on the bench. And then this ability to anticipate what they call counter strategies from other players. So if I have an agenda and I want to get it done, who are going to be the people that push back against it? And it looks like this. So when you, and you can do any kind of matrix, and you can have anything that you want on here, but this is the map that they recommend. So if you say, okay, there are certain players in my organizational context or my team or my industry that have a lot of power, and there are some that have very little power. There are some that are pro-change for whatever change I want to do, and then there are some that oppose that change. Understanding who is where helps you know where some negotiating needs to take place, where some bargaining needs to take place, and in some cases where the workaround needs to be. Now, I drew these circles somewhat to scale, to illustrate a point. There can be a lot of people down here that I would say are waffling between, they're waiting to be influenced, change or no change, one way or the other. Okay? And at this point, they have very little power, right? Now, let's say that you came in, somebody came in and said, okay, in my first 100 days, this is me being elected as president, in my first 100 days, we are going to kick 5 states out of the union. We're going back to 45 stars on the flag. There can be people that before I said that are down here. Depending on the state that I want to kick out, they may ramp up to a lot of power one way or the other by organizing support, by, you know, I'm sure that I will be roasted on social media in one way, shape, or form. But so when you initially map people, that doesn't mean that they have to stay there. There's also a tiny little dot up here in high power and opposes change. Is that an important dot? It's very small. Why is that very important? yeah. There's a magnetic pull, right, between the little dot and this big green dot, or there can be, if someone has a lot of power and is motivated one way or the other. Now, there can also be a very significant small dot on the other side of things that I didn't put there. But usually, in times where conflict is created, okay, I have seen people say, it's a very small dot. How important can it possibly be? So I'm going to work down here, you know, on the people that need to be influenced. And if I get this big glob, you know, a little bit more over to the pro-change without worrying about that little tiny dot up there, then I'll be fine. Those are leaders usually shortly thereafter out of a job. Okay? I know of one leader who ignored this dot, showed up at work one day, and literally was locked out of the building. And my favorite part of the story is they said, we'll mail you your stuff. Like, they're so mad at this guy, he doesn't even get to clean out his own desk. They're like, we got this, okay? UPS will deliver your stuff. We're done here, okay? But he ignored this dot because he looked at the relative size and says, how important can it possibly be? I've got all these other dots lining up in my favor, right? They're all pro-change. You forgot about the little dot. So when you learn to map, and some people do this very well, and some people do this instinctively, right? Really politically savvy people, they understand this map without ever having to draw it out. But I have actually encouraged people, get out a pen and paper, start putting names in the various categories. And none of this is a judgment against these people. Does everybody understand that before I get roasted on social media? Just because you have a lot of power and you're anti-change doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? The change may be a dumb idea. So this may be the righteous place to be on this map. So it's not necessarily a judgment thing, but this is realistic. Right? So how do you lead in an environment where you have people all over the map? That's where the political skill comes from. Networking and forming coalitions. This is, you know, of the 4 skills, agenda setting, map making, networking, and forming coalitions. This is understanding how people might work well together and who is not working together now but could be. And it could yield significant influence, or it could yield significant change, whatever it is. And this is that, this isn't manipulation, right? But this is understanding how interests, right, these enduring divergent interests, can sometimes align for the good of the team, the organization, the industry, whatever it is. And so being a leader and being a political worker saying, hey, actually, even though you two teams over here never spend any time together, did you realize that you have this, this, and this in common? And now all of a sudden we're using this, this, and this in common for the good of the entire team or the entire context. That's what it means to network and form coalitions. This last line, it says, after you identify the relevant relationships and assess who might resist and develop where possible the links, it says, if step 3 fails, carefully select and implement more subtle or forceful methods. So what the authors are saying is, we all understand that there are scenarios where the quote, big guns are required. But some people lead with big guns, right? They're not necessarily tyrants, but they just don't know how to measure force. And so what they're saying is, look for opportunities to link people and their interests. Look for ways to bring people together constructively, and if you have to, have a plan B. If you have to, have guns, big guns, and know that they're there to be used, but don't necessarily lead with them. And then this last political skill of bargaining and negotiating. I'm a terrible negotiator. Like, you want to negotiate with me because I'm not good at it. Now, I recognize that about myself, so I very rarely get into negotiating circumstances. Okay? In fact, the last car that I bought, I took my wife, who was pregnant at the time, and I took my brother. My brother loves to negotiate, and my brother's very good at it. And so I would show up. We did this at car dealerships all over town. I showed up, and the guy comes to me, right, because I'm the first one out of the car, and I go up, and he goes, hey, what kind of car are you looking for? And I go, let me explain to you how this is going to go. I'm going to write a check, okay? You have to convince her that she'll like it, and you have to convince him that it's a good deal. And it was the best car buying experience of my life. All I did was test drive, right? And then when numbers start going through, I look over at my brother. Yes? No? We don't like this one. We're moving on down the street. We'll drive their car. It's fantastic, right? But I understood my weaknesses and I understood his strengths, and we just worked with that. So I'm not going to spend any time talking to you about bargaining and negotiating. Read the book or any of the countless others. Or a couple of you smiled when I said bargaining and negotiating, and you people probably enjoy it, so I will send other people to you. Okay? So that's bargaining and negotiating. All right. Before we get to symbols, let's take a break real quick. All right. So we've talked about structure, talked about human resource, we talked about politics. Let's talk about symbols. Now, I'm going to show you some symbols up here. Tell me your reaction to seeing these logos, all of them, one of them. You tell me. It looks like America. That might be one of the scariest things I've ever heard, but okay, I can see that. All right. It looks like America. I like it. All right. Give me your reactions to some of these logos.
Edgy.
Which one's edgy?
The Harley Davidson.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Kind of rebel, the Raiders.
Okay. That's it. Those are the kind of people that suck it up. That's right. Yeah. Truer words. Yes.
Just win, baby.
Do what? Yeah. That's right. Just win, baby. Yeah. What else do you think about these?
Innovation.
Innovation. Okay.
Develop loyalty.
Innovation pointing to one in particular, or all of them?
Another writer.
Yeah. Nothing. Yeah.
That's kind of like having the market corner.
What do you mean?
Like,
Apple.
I'm getting distracted because they're all discussing what the bottom one is. Sorry. Do we know?
The bottom one.
Marine Corps.
Okay.
Sorry. U.S. Marine Corps emblem.
I guess beside that one, they're kind of like the quintessential, like, at least what I think of. When I think of motorcycles, I think of Harley Davidson. When I think of computers, I think of Apple and Microsoft. But
Sure, the Raiders.
when I think about football and I think about people being competitive over like their teams,
Sure.
I hear a lot about the Raiders.
So when you think of a fan base,
Yeah.
you think of the Raiders. Yeah.
I would say that's true. Besides the Broncos, which are right here.
Colorado.
I'm from Colorado.
Those four are really infused with identity. There's clear identity associated with those brands and logos.
Yeah. Yeah, these are 4 logos that are probably not going to be changed anytime soon. Right? These people don't play around. Even Apple, who has played with their logo over time, has never really strayed from the actual Apple all that much. They've messed with it color-wise, and it used to have a swoosh in it, and it used to be 3D, and there are some other things. But for the most part, it has always looked like that. Any other who knew that this was the Marine Corps emblem? How did you know that? Commercials. All right. All right, that's fair. If the Marines were here, they'd be like, yes. All right. Somebody else. How did you know this was the Marines?
I couldn't tell you. I saw that and thought Marine. I mean,
Okay.
I can't tell you how I knew that.
Well, I mean, I could see that though, because I mean, it's just with the anchor and the eagle. It's like, oh, that kind of looks like it could be a military.
I know it because of family.
You know it because of family. Yeah, I started with the actual seal of the Marine Corps, which says Department of the Navy Marine Corps on it, and I took that off just to see how many people would know what that was without it. So whether it's people, this is fascinating. I knew it, and I can't even tell you why. That to me is fascinating, and like you said, your logo's working. You know, if you're so embedded in your psyche that okay, that's there. Now I have to tell you, I was born and raised in Colorado Springs. To say Denver Bronco fan lifelong doesn't even do it justice. So to put Raiders on here hurt me. like physically, it made me a little ill. But I did it to elicit the response that you all gave me. So, but it's interesting in light of talking about these symbols. This quote, "Meaning is not given to us; we have to create it." However you responded to these symbols, you have created some meaning, right? For some, these mean innovation or a particular fan base, or, I mean, for me, the meaning associated with Raiders is I don't like them, right? Like I was raised to not like them. Not the individual players necessarily, but sometimes, but mostly just like the organization, I'm anti-Raiders, right? And I'm a product of my upbringing, and I am raising my sons in the same way. So if you think I've corrected that, no, we're leaning right into that. At 2 years old, my boys could both say, "Go Broncos," you know, so, you know, it was right after Dad, you know, so, and I have some Army ties, some pretty deep Army ties, but I put the Marine Corps logo up here specifically because I wanted to see who knew what it was. Meaning is not given to us, we have to create it. It's interesting and we could have played this game with a bunch of them. I started with a Mercedes logo, right? And if you see a Mercedes logo, just the circle and the 3 lines, what do you infer about that? What do you infer about the Mercedes logo? What meaning have you attached to it? Expensive. Yeah.
Luxury, well.
Classy.
Right, yeah, classy. Yeah, right. Classy, expensive, depends on what income bracket you're in. Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, or your expectations of it. Sure. Now, if I put this up here, now, because the resolution isn't that good, that Twin Towers are actually right there, and the eagle has a little tear. Anybody remember seeing this?
Oh, boy. No. Yes.
This was everywhere right after 9/11. Everywhere. And it wasn't necessarily this, but this whole kind of flag over the eagle crying, all of that. What is the meaning associated with this? One image. For some, it's patriotism, absolutely.
Is the nation resolve?
Yeah, there's a mourning. Yeah, for some, there's a resolve. I mean, there were country songs, right? Written in the same time that this came out. Some were patriotic. Let's just say others were aggressive. So all of that is packaged in there. What else is in this?
Most eagles don't have glue.
Right, yeah. It's actually, I think, a federal crime to do this to an eagle in real life. So yeah, I think they get you for something if you do that.
I mean, that's not an actual thing. That's symbolic.
Sure, yeah. And the powerful part of this particular image is that it's not one image, right? They said, okay, if we're going after patriotism, if we're going after kind of that we are America and this is the line in the sand thing, how can we best do that? Let's go grab our national bird and our flag and put them together and put the 9/11 towers in there, and we're going to do all of this, we're going to package it in one image, right, to speak to the metaphor. Now, if I was to create an organization and I use I just put this in a circle for my organization, would you attach meaning to my organization because of that? Absolutely.
They will sue you because
Yeah, that's true. They would sue me. You bring meaning, and not only that, but you're assuming that now there's a bunch of stuff behind this, metaphor that you are ascribing to me. In fact, some of you are ascribing that to me right now just for having it in the slide deck, right? So symbols are really, really powerful. And it's not just, there's a good logo and there's marketing reasons for that. But a symbol that tells a story and speaks as a metaphor on its own has a way of doing things that verbal communication can't, that marketing campaigns can't. There's just it's the whole picture of 1,000 words kind of thing. And you can do this, you can use symbols in a bunch of different ways. It may be a metaphor for telling a story. It may be using humor as a symbol, as a way of, maybe it's easing tension, maybe it's telling a story in an organization. So the symbolic frame deals with the power of culture and the power of symbols and stories and myths and all these things. And so the symbolic frame approaches organizational leadership by saying it's not necessarily what happens that is the most important, it's what it means. And they take a direct shot in the book at strategic planning from a symbolic frame. And strategic planning is my master's degree, and so I'm partial to being hit with that. But they say sometimes organizations will do strategic planning just to appear like they have a plan for the next 5 years, right? Like it's a total charade. It's like this is all show. We all know that we're going to go through this year of strategic planning. We're going to get a very nice, colorful binder. We're going to put the binder on our shelves so that everybody can see it, and we're not doing anything with it beyond that, right? It's all a show. And so when I showed you the metaphor slide here, it's hard to see, but these are theater seats, and there's a carousel at a carnival, and here's a temple. The metaphor that the authors use for this frame is this idea that there are temples involved, there are performances involved, there's play involved, and all of that is part of this kind of symbolic life of organizations. And so when you are talking about symbolic assumptions, it says activity and meaning are loosely coupled. Events and actions have multiple interpretations as people experience life differently. And we'll see how that's borne out in just a second, but let's say fundraising campaign. Yeah. Okay? I didn't say who was fundraising, Lee, calm down. But that's going to play nicely for my analogy, thank you. So if you hear the words fundraising campaign, what do you bring to that? How are you interpreting that meaning? Lee obviously is in favor, okay? Run. Right, yeah. When my wife and I, the last time that we were, church shopping, if I saw a thermometer on the wall, right, and the monetary increments going, We were like, nope. I mean, this guy, this preacher better be fantastic. They better love my kids because there's already a thermometer on the wall. I am not signing up for this, okay? That's just my own personal baggage, and yes, I probably need counseling. But there are, right there are those buzz phrases. Those are events that happen in the life cycle of an organization that hit people differently. And a fundraising campaign is just a fun way to make fun of that. Events and processes are often more important for what is expressed than what is produced. Again, the strategic planning analogy. And then this statement, their emblematic form weaves a tapestry of secular myths, heroes, heroines, rituals, ceremonies, and stories that help people find purpose and passion. Does anybody have or have ever worked in a place that had stories bordering on myths, but just these are the stories that people tell, right? Or maybe it's these are the books that people in our organization read, or this is the language that we use. Has anybody ever worked in an environment like this? There's a knowing nod, but not a I want to tell this story knowing nod. It's just, yes, we have, and let's not talk about it. So, okay, all right.
In churches, we're reading the Bible.
Yes, yes. But beyond that, there's something a little bit more unique.
The stories your church history has, how you get to point A to point B, how you accomplish.
Now, some churches really have that as a key part of their identity, and other churches don't. I mean, some people will attend their church for years and not know the history of. Now, in some churches, you can't be there 2 weeks without knowing the history of the church. So that's a good example, right? It just depends on how they leverage that story. Give me another example of something that you've seen.
I worked for Hewlett-Packard for a long time.
Okay.
It's always the HP way. It harkens back to the founders, Hewlett and Packard, and their approach to things. They still have the garage in Silicon Valley where it all started. It's now a national registry or whatever. And so they always harken back to that innovation. They have videos of their offices that are still in place like they were when they last worked there in the open environment, things like that. And so that's a story that always gets told, and things drawn from it as part of the HP way.
I was going to say, and you led with the key marker in that story, which is the HP way, right? If you walk around HP and you say the HP way, all of a sudden tons of meaning floods into that. You can stand up in a meeting in dealing with a product or a process and go, that's not the HP way, and everybody goes, oh yeah, okay, we or that is the HP way. Yes, let's do more of that. Yeah, absolutely.
Say 50%, Tycho.
That's true. So, somebody else have an example of a cultural meaning or a totem or something? Yeah.
Well, it's not an organization I'm a part of, but it's one that I have a close friendship and affiliation with that deals with renewing neighborhoods and community renewal. And a couple of stories that keep getting told about the founder, and that is he started just by walking into the most dangerous neighborhoods and street ports, knocking on doors and saying, hello, my name is, and if we could just learn how to be friends, I'm sure our city could be a better place. Followed up with stories about how in some of those, at least one occasion, that same instance, but in that same neighborhood, how he walked up to a drug house and knocked on the door, and somebody they were locking the load, they thought he was FBI, and were about to take him out. Now, I don't know if those are the kind of stories that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
But they get told over and over. And I've heard 3 or 4 versions of that last one that I just told you, including 2 or 3 from him, so I don't know which one is true.
Yeah, and that's how stories really become myths, right? They get passed down, they get retold, get a little artistic license built in there every once in a while. But yeah, absolutely. But
the details are important to me.
That's right. That's right. People are ascribing to meaning, and that story is helping them make sense of their life within that team or organization, right? The HP way, for some, I'm sure, they're saying, I work at HP because we do things the HP way. And that helps me make sense. The hard days, I'm putting in extra hours and we're doing this, or a product is lagging behind, but we're striving for the HP way, right? Ask most Southwest employees. right, about the culture of their organization. And you will get a variety of responses. You'll get responses like, they listen to what I say, right? Their uniforms, what the crew wears, what the people behind the desks wear, that was by employee design. Like the employees actually said, this is what we want to wear. We want to be able to wear shorts. You know, the guys tossing the bags, especially in Houston, you know, that's a no-brainer. But the flight crew is like, we want to be comfortable. So no more business attire and loafers. We want tennis shoes because we're on our feet all day in a hallway this big. So, you know, let's be comfortable while we do that. And the company's like, yeah, and why? Because they get more out of their employees, the employees invest more, and the company as a whole rises. But those are the stories that get told. The rituals, the ceremonies, the military is famous for this, right? Even on how they change commanders at posts, right? Where you have one commander come up to the current commander, you know, the future commander comes up and says, you know, I relieve you, and that old commander says, I stand relieved, and they immediately change the sign. Like with the old commander standing there, they're saying, this is the new commander, we have installed, he has passed the banner from one to the other. This is a very formal process, it's a very formal ritual. That's not because the military just likes doing rituals. They understand that there is a unifying force in some of those rituals and ceremonies and other things. And there's a pride that comes along with that, right? And it can get, you know, weird at a time, and if it goes too far along, this is where hazing comes from and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, there's a lot of power in that. And so when you are talking about culture, one of the best writers on organizational culture in particular is a guy named Edgar Schein, and he's been writing since the 70s or 80s. He got famous in the 90s, and he's been a consultant since then, Schein, Edgar Schein. He does a lot of stuff, and he's the one who gets credited with the quote, culture is the way we do things around here. In fact, he got so famous for that, now when people interview him, they have to say, now why isn't it just the way we do things around here? And that's kind of his launch pad for his talks. But if culture is the way we do things around here, like I'll give you an example about UBA. When I was hired 11 and a half years ago, they said there are 2 books, if you haven't read, you have to read because you have to have some vocabulary because we use it all the time. Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge, who talks about systems theory, and Good to Great by Jim Collins. Because we'll be in a meeting and I'll say, okay, well, we don't have the right people on the bus, or this is a flywheel initiative. Well, around here, that sounds like jargon, but we all know what we mean because we all read that book, and that's a key part of our identity. If you're visiting our staff meeting, you're like, these people don't even speak in real sentences. I mean, we do, but it's for our own benefit, right? We're getting ready to hire a guy in February. Well, he's coming in February. He's just not here yet. And I already told him, I was like, dude, start reading these books. Just be ready, because this is part of who we are. It's the way we do things around here. And so the way that you build culture and bring it about is, there are a lot of different ways to do that. How someone becomes a group member, how you hire someone says a lot about your organization or your team. How do you welcome them? Do you welcome them? You say, here's your desk, get busy. You know, is that the formal process that you go through there? That says something about your team. Diversity supports a team's competitive advantage, and how seriously you take diversity and why. Is it political maneuvering, or is it that you believe it brings an asset and strength to your team? Example, not command, holds a team together. If you're following a leader because he practices what he preaches, that has a more powerful and long-lasting effect than someone who just says, I'm the boss, do it this way. Again, specialized language, and that can foster commitment, stories, values, stories that reinforce values. In particular, there are a number of stories that I could tell you about UBA culture that we run to say, this demonstrates our value. And this situation is kind of like when this happened in our organizational history. And I can tell you, being a staff member on a team, like I have 11 and a half years tenure and I'm the most recent new hire. Everybody else has been here 20 years plus. There are a lot of stories that get told that I'm like, what, who, what? I wasn't here for that, you know? But now, it's funny, I've been here so long, people think that I've been there for some of those stories, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't in the room when that happened. I was in junior high when that happened. And yes, I only play that card when it really makes me laugh. But I do play it. Ritual and ceremonies that lift spirits and reinforce values. Informal cultural players make contributions disproportionate to their formal role. There are people on teams who speak more to the forming of culture and speak more to the forming of the environment than maybe their formal capacity would allow you to think they do, right? They make movies every once in a while about how, the water boy on the football team was more important to the culture of that team than the quarterback or the coach or whatever else like that. That's kind of the myth taken to epic proportions, but that's where the idea comes from. And then they say in the book, soul is the secret to success. So that's the symbolic frame. So what? What do we do now that we have the ability to understand some of those frames? What do we do with that information? Well, the first thing is we go back and say, okay, do we understand what it means to be leading according to one of those frames? So if you are leading and leading effectively and leading well according to the structural frame, you are, in essence, a social architect. And what that means is you are positioning points in the system for maximum benefit. And notice I didn't say maximum efficiency, because you may get all the cogs in the system lined up and you may be burning through people at the same time. But that's not what a social architect does. It's putting the system together in the way that is the most beneficial to everyone involved. Customers and employees, right? Clients and employees. The team and the product being produced. Now, there's a difference between a social architect and a petty bureaucrat, right? Bureaucrats lead in the structural frame. What they are doing is they're organizing the system for their own benefit. So rather than being and we talked about this when we talked about charismatic and narcissistic leadership, rather than being a socialized leader, which means for the good of the group, they're a personalized leader. And so they're organizing the system for their own personal benefit. So there's a line, right, when leading in the structural frame between a social architect and a petty bureaucrat. You want to be on the social architect side of things. When you lead according to the human resource frame, you are endeavoring to be a catalyst and a servant. We talked a lot about what servant leadership looks like in the very first Leadership Cafe last fall. There is a difference between serving people and just being a pushover. There is a difference between being a servant and a weakling. Does anybody know the definition of a catalyst? And we all have a mental model associated with the idea of catalyst. Anybody know what the definition of a catalyst is?
It's something you add or something that creates a reaction.
Yeah, it's something that creates a reaction, but that isn't necessarily transformed in that reaction, right? So so a catalyst is an initiator of a reaction. It's a little bit different than saying, I'm going to be a transforming leader, because that assumes some level of transformation in the leader themselves. If you say, I'm going to be a catalytic leader, what you're technically saying is, I'm going to get other stuff in other people without necessarily being part of that change process. So I always caution people, use the word catalyst carefully, because sometimes it can make you sound like a really good leader who's technically giving yourself permission to be aloof. Nobody uses it that way, but because mostly that's a really bad bumper sticker. But the political frame, if you are leading in the political frame, people want an advocate, right? If you are a politically savvy person and people like that about you, it means that they see you more as an advocate and someone who will negotiate for the greater good, as opposed to being a con artist or a thug, right? The symbolic frame, you are endeavoring to lead by being poet and prophet, as opposed to being a fanatic or a charlatan, as the authors say. Now, when I say it's the prophetic role of leadership in the symbolic frame, what does that mean?
We're very visionary.
It does mean visionary, though you can do that in the other frames. I mean, there are a lot of structural leaders that default to that are very good visionaries because they're lining up the system to achieve a particular goal. What does it mean to be a prophet in the symbolic frame?
Storyteller.
Yeah, storyteller. When you are building up that culture, right? You are ascribing meaning to things. Now,
Piece for the coach.
do what?
That's the piece for the coach, because a coach makes kids do work that they wouldn't want to do. But there has to be meaning behind that work, and that's what the symbolic piece is.
Yeah, and actually, it can't. So this is the part of the coach right before the game. Most of what coaching is structural. I mean, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, as long as you're talking about coaching in every way except for kind of the new definition of coaching, which is I'm just going to ask you questions and allow you to get to your own conclusion. But coaching, especially in athletic endeavors, is, okay, if you want to, like I was a special teams coach for a football team, if you want to kick field goals, there is a way to do that, and there's a way to not do that. There's a way to kick a 50-yard field goal, and there's a way to hit your line in the back of the head with the ball. We should prefer to get points, right? So I'm going to coach you on the technicalities of how to do that. Now, having done that all week long, now it's Sunday and it's 10 minutes before the big game. Now let's get ramped up and let's remember, we're a team, let's play together, let's do all these things, and that's kind of the rah-rah part of it. And it's interesting if you talk to former athletes, especially former pro athletes, they will talk about missing the locker room, right? They're talking about actually this frame. They're talking about missing the relationships. Very rarely will you hear them say, I really miss those pregame speeches, right? But this and the human resource frame and the symbolic frame can be really tied together when it comes to culture. Because if you have guys that play for really successful teams, and they'll say, man, there was something about being at that place. And they can't even put their finger on it, but there was something about it. It was the guys in the locker room. It was the coaches that cared for us. It was the way that we won. All of those things, those are veiled references to the human resource and symbolic frame. That's how that gets played out.
Can you tie in the future-telling part of being a prophet to that role?
To the symbolic frame?
Well, yeah, just the use of the word prophet, which is obviously someone who foretells the future. How does that tie in with leadership?
So it's hugely important when you are casting a vision, people line up to achieve a preferred future. But there are a lot of leaders out there that don't tell a preferred future. They just tell a future. And so they'll say...
Sort of like what you were saying about putting together strategic plans, but having no intent.
Right, yeah, So there's a big difference between saying, well, our vision is to increase our revenues by 2% every year over the next 5 years and open up new markets and blah, blah, blah. And all of that may be good, right? Especially if you own stock in that company, that may be good for you. It's not inspiring, right? There's nothing symbolic about that. The symbolic way to cast a vision or to future would be a computer on every desk kind of thing. Or what did he say, 5,000 songs in your pocket when Jobs first introduced the iPod. That is a visionary way of casting a preferred future. Or, to go back even further, it's Kennedy saying, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. Having, at the time, no concept at Rice. He did it on the football field at Rice. I should say that for our Rice alum here. But the fascinating part about that Kennedy speech, and I've said this before, is when he's casting that vision, he has no clue how that's going to happen. The nation had no clue. In fact, the President of the United States says, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth and do the other things. That's a quote. He has no idea what the other things are. But he stands up in front of the nation and says, and we're going to do all that other stuff that it takes to hit that shiny thing there and get a guy say, okay, you know, but the nation's like, we are going to do the other things, you know? What are those other things, you know? And so the guys at NASA are like, actually, we have a long list of other things. But that's, right, the power of a prophet as opposed to the power of a structural engineer saying, this is what the future looks like. And there's a role for both, though, right? Because you can't be all prophet. It can't just be a guy who stands up in front of a big crowd and says, and do the other things. Now go get them, right? Because everybody wanders around going, are you doing the other things? I'm not doing the other. I don't know what the other things are, right? They need some structure to that. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask, how do you tie that word charlatan into symbolic?
There is a way to provide a sense of false value and false. Sorry, what?
Well, I said it could be a false prophet.
Yeah, it could be so making false promises, but there's also a way to build up kind of a symbolic estimation of either a team or a company without the actual structure to back it up, right? So the example that gets tossed around a lot is Enron. When the top shelf Enron leaders are saying, we're smarter than everybody else. Well, that's a story that's going to get told and told and told until, right? Until they're not anymore. And then you start to reframe what they said and go, oh, actually, they weren't the smartest guys in the room. And so that's how I would.
I've got a good quote that applies to this, and I'm not sure who to attribute it to. I'm sure we could look it up, but vision without execution is hallucination.
Yeah, and actually I just blanked on who said that, but yeah.
Unless you execute, it's all hallucination.
That's right. And actually, executing without vision can be progress. It's usually not transformational progress. It's usually incremental. And it's usually the kind of progress where people clock in, clock out, and don't give it another thought. So you can still achieve that, but it's a little bit different. So when you look at the leadership challenges that are associated with each of these frames, each of them comes with not only their benefits, but also their nuances, and their challenges. So the structural challenge is to attune the structure to the task and the environment. That seems to be bottom shelf, no-brainer stuff, but there are a lot of companies out there with a ton of structure that doesn't have a whole lot to do with their specific task. And there are a lot of companies out there that say, you know what we could do? We could do this. It's not really what we started out by doing, but we could do this, we could also do this, we could also do this, and all of a sudden, they've wandered away from their values, they've wandered away from their initial purpose, and they may be doing some of those things, but all of a sudden, they're not trying to line up their structure with a task. They're lining up their structure with their goals, not the processes and not their specific environment. The challenge in the human resource frame is to align the organization and the human needs without balancing too far on either end of the spectrum, right? You can be totally devoted to your employees and go out of business very quickly. You can make a ton of money and burn through your employees very quickly, but there's a balance to be achieved there. The challenge for political leaders is to develop that agenda and cultivate a power base, right? Because the political frame, again, would say conflict is going to happen. You deal with conflict based on power. Now, people think amass power, now I'm a tyrant. No. If you are a political operative, you are building relationships so that you know who to call or who will support you or who won't support you, and you know that ahead of time, and all of that to deal with the inevitable conflict, right? All of that is cultivated through a power base. And then the challenge of the symbolic frame is to create faith and beauty and meaning in these various things in order to advance the goals of the organization, right? Not just to prop up things on a faith-based level, but for some organizational end. So the way that this plays out is we have various things over on the left-hand side, strategic planning, reorganizing, meetings, and communication, and how each frame might perceive the same activity. So let's take meetings, for example. meetings on the structural frame is a formal occasion to make decisions, right? Why else have them? That's what a really natural structural leader would say. I don't need to get around people for any other reason than to accomplish something. Let's make a decision. The human resource person would say, these are informal occasions to involve and share feelings and, get people around a table, team building, right? To an introvert structural guy like myself, team building is like, oh, really? Like, this is going to be exhausting, I can already tell. But for you extroverts out there, you're like, yes, more of that, let's do that, and you'll love it. And that introverts never do that, but, so meetings for political frame leaders are competitive occasions to score points, okay? And think about that. Now, again, that's going to sound, see, I knew we were into the manipulative, thug, con artist definition of politics. That's not it. When politicians get together to have meetings, right, what are they doing? They're shoring up support, they're currying favor, they're building new relationships, right? They're demonstrating that they are a person worthy of having a relationship and support with, right? All of that is trying to figure out who has chips, who has credits, how do I get more, because I'm going to need them at some point in the future. Meetings for the symbolic frame are sacred occasions to celebrate and transform culture. And it very closely tied to communication. If you're a symbolic leader, communication is an opportunity to tell a story. Now, the interesting thing is, I'm sure there's research out there that ties personality types to each one of those frames. But that actually is not the point of this book. Because what that would do is lend itself to saying, well, you're a structural leader, go be a structural leader and do it really well. The point of this book is to say, okay, you as a leader are going to come up with meetings, and you may have someone in your team that's coming with a political purpose. You may have somebody else on your team coming with a structural purpose. And you, as an effective leader, need to understand, okay, if they're coming with a political purpose, what are they looking for? They're looking to score points. They're looking for an agenda. They're looking for an arena where some of these interactions take place. If you're dealing with a human resource person, well, they're coming to that meeting for a different reason. And you have to be able to lead that team cohesively because you can't segment that cleanly, right? And that's called frame breaking. So when somebody comes to you and says, well, I don't know why that other employee doesn't like me. We have a real strong personality conflict and we're just not going to be able to get along. Okay, you can deal with that in the human resource frame. Or you can say, I wonder why it is that they don't get along. Is it really just a personality mismatch? Or is it because this person is not competitive at all and the person that doesn't like them is really competitive? So maybe there is a political solution to be found there. Maybe there is a symbolic solution to be found there because they've both taken their eye off the ball of what we're really about doing here. And now they're getting down into the trenches and the gutters just between the two of them. So the ability to jump from frame to frame is what we call frame breaking. There's a ton more in here. There is things as far as diagnostic questions, when to choose a particular frame. And I hold to these pretty loosely, but they're in there. An example is, are individual commitment and motivation essential to success? Now, for those of you that are very human resource sensitive, okay, have high emotional intelligence quotients, you probably think every leadership task involves commitment and motivation, essential to success, right? That's how you lead. I'm a structural person, so I don't suffer from that burden. But I am aware that there are those of you out there, weirdos. But there are times where that's hugely important, more important than the production of another widget, right? So when you come up against a leadership task that has to have people on board, they have to be committed, they have to be invested. Leading in that endeavor from a structural point of view is a massive waste of time, right? Because nobody gears up for that. Now, on the other side of things, if you have something like at HP where the technical solution has to work. Like, you can't just feel good about the computer that comes off the line if it doesn't do what you want it to do, right? Man, our employees love that computer. It's a great coaster, you know. Nothing else about it is really good, but it's shiny, it looks great, you know. No, the technicality of that really matters. That you have to lead in a structural frame. And you kind of have to wash the other problems through that particular lens. So there's some diagnostic questions also in the book there. There are ways to deal with barriers to change. When you come up against, and I'm going to jump down to the symbolic here. I'm a church consultant, and so some of the times that I work with churches, it is because they are looking to victories in the past, and they can't get past the past. Does that make sense? And so they'll say, we're going to hire another pastor, or we're going to move to a different neighborhood, or we're going to build another building, and all the while, whether they would admit it or not, whether they even have the capability to admit it or not, they're trying to achieve the past. In that environment, it doesn't do me any good to say, well, I have a master's degree in strategic planning, let me lead you through this structural exercise. Because that's not what they're actually after. And so I have to be able to interpret what's really going on there and see that through the symbolic lens that they're seeing it through. And so if that's the barrier, they're clinging to the past, then the strategy for the future is, okay, we have to find new ways to create meaning. Because the only place that church is finding meaning is in the past. So we have to find meaning in the future. And maybe there is a transition ritual that needs to take place. I just recommended a couple weeks ago to a church, they're getting ready to close, and I said, you need to have a funeral. You need to give yourself a specific opportunity to mourn. And that's not to say that they aren't going on to do great things, because they are in this particular case. But there is still an element in there where they need to mourn and get it out, right? And use that to get past and move on to something new. Well, if you skip that step, even me being a structural guy and an introvert, I understand the perils of that particular plan, right? So there is a barrier to change, and there's also a strategy to engage that change. There are other ways to deal with that, and we won't get down into the weeds of that, but every frame has inherent barriers, and every frame has inherent strategies that can work. But a good leader understands there's a particular context and situation where some of these are going to apply and where they're not always going to apply. And if you're not sensitive to that, then you get in trouble. And I'm going to leave you with this quote: modern organizations often rely too much on engineering and too little on art in searching for commitment, quality, and creativity. It's very early on in the book. I think it's actually in the introductory paragraph. But just to say, there are a lot of education plans that teach leadership as in the structural frame, right? They say if you're going to lead an organization, you do A through F, you bring these particular skills, you line up people according to this, you operate through a particular kind of structure, and that is how you do leadership. That may work, but what if you get into an environment where that doesn't work, right? In ministry circles or in nonprofit circles, my wife does a lot of work with nonprofits, and particularly grant writing, and I sometimes harass her. I'm like, well, isn't that kind of a boilerplate for this other nonprofit? And she always comes back with, they're different. There are little shades of gray in there, and we gotta build this particular grant to the specific context. That's very sensitive, one, to the context, but also there's an art, right, to learning that particular context and learning how to adapt to it. So 2 questions really briefly. What's the most challenging thing you heard today? And you can offer up a response, or you can just think about that for a second. What was the most challenging thing you heard today? What messed with you the most? I should say, I'm a big fan of this book, Reframing Organizations, but I will say that there are some people that just say, I don't need to know the other frames. If I know my own frame, then I can hire the rest. That's typically the response. There are some in this room that might feel that way, hypothetically, I've heard. So what's the most challenging thing you heard today? Anybody want to offer a response? You're like, no. What's the next question? The next question would be this. What was the most helpful thing you heard today or thought about today, as I almost spilled my coffee on my iPad? What's the most helpful thing that you have heard or thought about today? And somebody give me a response to that. Most helpful, most challenging? Give me something.
Me is you pointing out those different frames and me understanding that I've seen all of that but had no idea what it was. And then I think the most challenging is now to learn that skill set to deal with those people who are in those frames from a standpoint of leadership.
Yeah. Someone else? Helpful, challenging?
It's just helpful to have the different perspectives in a huge way, just to be able to name them and understand that. I have a meeting following this one, and I'm thinking about, wow, so that's where this particular individual's at, and how does that influence and then also realizing the individual I'm meeting with is highly ADD and jumps from frame to frame, which, I can't throw rocks at all probably, but just having that, just being able to name it so you can see it and so that you can work with it is a huge insight.
It's again, playing with those mental models. We're all processing information through a particular set of lenses. And having knowledge about what is in your own lens is extremely helpful for understanding how you're processing information. It's somewhere where that emotional intelligence comes from. I'm going to let you go, but I do want to give you one more thing. The last 4 chapters maybe, of this book are kind of a landscape survey of other leadership theories and sources out there, a lot of which we have already covered in different leadership cafes, and some of which we will cover in future leadership cafes. And so if you want kind of a primer version of those things, that is also in the book. Again, I highly recommend it. Here are the future dates for leadership.